The first warning did not come from the sky. It came from under the floor. In the last dark hours of November 1886, on a bare rise above Cottonwood Draw, Patch lifted his gray muzzle from beside the stove and whined toward the north wall. Not barked, not growled, whined, as if something alive had crawled beneath the cabin and found its way into the room. Elias Harrow opened his eyes. For a moment he heard only the prairie, wind scraping over frozen grass, the stove ticking softly, a loose spoon hanging near the chimney tapping once against its nail. Then the cold touched his feet. It was not the usual cold that settled near the door after midnight. This came in a narrow blade from below, sliding between two floor planks beside the bed. Elias knelt and pressed his hand to the seam. The wood felt hard and dead, cold enough to make his fingers ache. Across the room, Jonah slept with both knees tucked against his chest. Lydia lay on her side near the stove, her shawl pulled to her chin, one hand resting over the child she carried. Even asleep, she held that hand there as if she could shield the baby from weather. Elias stood and looked through the frost-clouded window. Outside, moonlight showed the strange thing everyone in the draw had been laughing about for weeks, a rough wall of limestone and field rock standing around his cabin, not touching it, not finished, and not shaped like anything a sane man would build before winter. The wall stopped halfway up the north side. The gap between stone and wood showed dark in the moonlight, a black belt of emptiness around the house. Elias looked at that empty space, then at Lydia's hand over her belly. He knew with a certainty that settled heavier than fear. If the wall was not finished before the first true blizzard, this cabin would not merely be cold. It would give the wind a way to take them apart. The Harrow cabin had been built in haste after the grasshopper year, when Elias had been more worried about getting a roof over his family than waiting for proper timber to cure. The cottonwood logs looked solid when he stacked them. By the next winter, they had shrunk, twisted, and opened hairline cracks that the prairie seemed to remember. Snow found the sill line first. It slid beneath the north wall in white threads, melted during the day, and froze again after sunset. Frost crawled up the inside chinking. On the worst mornings, Lydia could set a cup near the wall and find a rim of ice around the bottom by breakfast. Elias tried the answers every man knew. More mud in the chinks, more quilts over the bunks, more wood in the stove. The stove roared until its sides glowed dull red, but the warmth never stayed. It ran out of the cabin as fast as Elias could make it, pulled through cracks, under floorboards, and up the chimney whenever the wind shifted across the ridge. Then came the night that changed what he blamed. A storm hit from the northwest and pushed smoke straight back down the pipe. Within minutes, the cabin filled with gray, bitter air. Jonah coughed until he vomited into a pail. Lydia staggered for the door, with tears running from her smoke-burned eyes. Elias shoved the door open against the gale, and snow burst into the room so hard it crossed the floor like thrown sand. After that night, he stopped thinking of winter as temperature. He began thinking of it as movement. By late September, everyone along Cottonwood Draw had seen him dragging stone from the dry creek bed south of the rise. He used a mule when the animal would pull. When the sled sank in mud, Elias leaned into the rope himself and hauled until the leather cut through his coat. The stones were not impressive. Pale limestone slabs, red sandstone chunks, old creek-rounded field rock. He stacked them in piles beside the cabin while neighbors rode past slowly and pretended not to stare. Then the staring became talk. Amos Brill was the loudest. He owned the bigger haylot west of the draw and had survived enough winters to believe experience was the same thing as truth. One afternoon he reined his horse near Elias's unfinished wall and studied the narrow space behind it. "You're leaving a hole," Amos said. Elias kept packing mortar under a flat stone. Amos leaned forward in the saddle. "A hole all the way round the cabin." "Not all the way," Elias said. "Only where the wind bites hardest." That answer only irritated Amos. He swung down, stepped close, and pushed his gloved fingers into the space between the new stone face and the old log wall. The gap swallowed his hand to the wrist. "You wrap a cabin in rock," he said, "and leave air behind it? First snow that settles there will turn the whole place into an icebox." Lydia stood in the doorway with a mending basket against her hip. Her face did not change, but Elias saw her fingers tighten on the basket handle. Amos touched one limestone block and shook his head. "That stone will hold cold longer than wood ever could. You are building your wife a cellar." Elias set another stone into the wall and pressed it until mortar squeezed from the seam. "I am not trying to make the stone warm," he said. Amos waited. Elias looked toward the prairie grass bending flat under the north wind. "I am trying to make the wind spend itself before it reaches the logs." Years earlier, before Lydia, before Jonah, before Cottonwood Draw, Elias had worked 2 winters at a rail grading camp near the Laramie foothills. The work was mostly pick, shovel, frozen hands, and bad coffee. But the camp had one man everyone listened to when weather turned ugly, a Welsh mason named Rhys Morgan, who built powder sheds and ice houses that never sweated inside. Rhys did not teach with books. He taught by making young men stand in the cold and feel walls with their palms. One bitter night, he took Elias to a storage hut tucked against a slope of broken stone. Wind screamed outside, hard enough to lift snow from the ground in sheets. Inside, a single candle burned on a crate. The flame did not lean. Rhys tapped the outer stone wall with his knuckles. Then he pointed to the wooden inner wall set several inches behind it. Between them was a narrow, dark space, with small openings low near the floor and higher beneath the roofline. "Everybody thinks a wall keeps out cold," Rhys said. "A wall keeps out weather. Still air keeps what you paid for." He showed Elias the trick. The outside wall took the pressure. The empty pocket slowed the air until it stopped carrying warmth away. Small vents let dampness escape before it could rot the wood or freeze the mortar. Low openings were offset from high ones so wind could not shoot straight through. Then Rhys scraped frost from a careless seam and held it out on his thumb. "Trap wet air," he warned, "and you have built a knife." Elias remembered that sentence better than anything else the man had said. So the wall around the Harrow cabin was never meant to hug the house. It was meant to stand away from it. 6 to 8 inches on the north side, narrower along the west, with a gravel trench below and small staggered vents that most men mistook for bad workmanship. He dug the trench first, almost 1.5 feet deep, and filled it with creek gravel so meltwater could travel instead of pooling beneath the stones. He laid the lower rocks at a slight outward angle to break drifting snow before it packed against the logs. Every few feet he left a slit near the bottom. Higher up, under the crude roof overhang, he left matching slits set off to the side. Jonah watched him one afternoon with a strip of rawhide in his mouth and a frown deep enough to make him look older than 8. "Pa?" Elias scraped excess mortar from a joint. If wind is the trouble, why are you making windows for it? Elias almost smiled. Then he looked at the wet mortar darkening in the seam, the drainage gravel below, and the old cottonwood wall behind the gap. Because a shut box gets wet, he said, and wet walls belong to winter. Jonah did not understand, not fully, but Lydia, who was sewing near the doorway from scraps of Elias's worn coat, stopped moving her needle. The first freeze came before the north wall was finished. At dawn, Elias found white crystals gathered behind one lower course where damp air had stalled overnight. The mortar had not dried properly. A cold bridge was beginning, small but dangerous. If it froze hard enough, the stone could carry winter inward instead of blocking it. He took a hammer and chisel and broke out half a day's work before breakfast. The sound carried across the draw. Amos Brill happened to ride by and stopped when he saw the stones falling loose. "I told you," he called over the wind. "Rock sweats. Wood breathes. You cannot argue with that." Elias did not answer. He widened the lower slit, opened the gravel channel, and mixed the next mortar with more lime and sharper sand. By afternoon, his hands were cracked and white. By evening, the rebuilt course stood uglier than before, but drier. That night, Patch did something Lydia noticed first. The dog circled near the stove, looked once toward the north wall, and then lay down along the floor beside the repaired section. All through the previous winter, he had refused that corner. He had slept only near the stove or against Jonah's feet. Now he put his head on his paws and stayed. Lydia watched him for a long time. Then her hand, the hand that always guarded her belly, slipped slowly into her lap. By the first week of November, the stone shell was complete. It was not pretty. No mason would have praised the line of it. The north face bulged in places where Elias had chosen thickness over beauty. The west side carried a scar of red sandstone through the pale limestone. The vents were small, dark cuts, half hidden by shadow. The low skirt of angled rock made the whole house look as if it had been braced for a siege. That was exactly how it felt. Birds disappeared from the fence posts. The horses in Amos Brill's lot stood with their tails to the north. The sky lowered until the ridge seemed pressed beneath it. Elias spent the last clear afternoon checking everything he could still control. He cleaned the lower vents with a stick. He lifted the chimney cap and set it again. He cleared loose grass from the drainage trench. He touched the old cottonwood logs inside the air pocket and found them cool but dry. At dusk, the prairie went still. Not calm. Still. Patch paced the room in a slow circle. Jonah asked twice whether the spoon by the stove had stopped moving because the wind had died. Elias did not answer the second time. Near midnight, the storm struck. It did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a wall thrown across the prairie. Snow hit the stone shell first with a dry, rasping sound, thousands of grains tearing over limestone. The cabin gave one hard shudder. Lydia pulled Jonah against her. Patch sprang up and barked once toward the chimney. A breath of smoke pushed down the pipe and curled beneath the rafters. Elias watched the lamp. The flame leaned, only a little. Then it straightened. He looked toward the north wall, where the storm was hammering the stone instead of the old cottonwood logs, and he felt something inside him tighten into a tension. Not relief, not yet. This was only the first test. By the middle of the night, the lower north vent began to disappear under drifted snow. That frightened Elias more than the noise. If the lower air path closed, dampness would stall inside the cavity. If dampness stalled, frost would build. If frost built long enough, the gap that was meant to save them could become the very thing that stole their heat. He wrapped a scarf over his mouth, grabbed the iron bar, and opened the door. The storm hit him sideways before he had one boot outside. Snow filled the world instantly. The cabin vanished behind him, except for the dark line of stone under his hand. He moved along the wall by touch. At the lower slit, ice had crusted over the opening. Elias dropped to one knee and drove the bar into it. Frozen snow broke loose in hard chunks and disappeared into the white rush. Wind slammed him into the wall so sharply his shoulder went numb. But through the glove on his left hand, he felt something he had not felt the winter before. The cabin was no longer trembling behind the blow. The storm was spending itself on the stone. He widened the vent by 2 fingers and wedged a flat shard of sandstone above it, like a little brow, angled down so loose powder would slide away instead of packing inward. By the time he stumbled back inside, his beard was white and his coat stiff with ice. Lydia reached for him, but he held up one hand and went straight to the north wall. He pressed his palm against the inside logs. Cool, not frozen. Then he looked at the lamp. The flame stood nearly vertical. On the second night, Jonah woke to a silence he could not name. The storm was still raging, snow still hissed against the stones, wind still roared over the roof. But something inside the cabin was missing. The spoon no longer tapped against its nail. Last winter, that spoon had chattered through every hard gust. The table legs had creaked. The floor had hummed. Air had whispered through the chinks so sharply that Jonah used to hold a blanket to his ears. Now the sounds were outside. Not gone. Outside. Patch lay along the north wall, with his body stretched long, his paws twitching in sleep. Lydia sat in the rocker, mending a tiny shirt from the lining of Elias's old coat. For the first time in days, her shawl had slipped from one shoulder, and she had not noticed. Elias checked the wood stack before dawn and counted twice. They had burned less than half what he expected. Still, he would not trust the wall completely. After daylight, he crawled into the lee of the house and found a thin crack running through one lower mortar joint near the west skirt. Freeze pressure. Small enough to repair, large enough to remind him that the prairie had not lost interest. He packed the crack with lime mortar under a canvas shield while snow blew over his back. On the third day, the cabin began to feel impossible. Not warm like summer, not comfortable enough to forget the storm, only separate. The stove made heat, and the heat remained long enough to matter. Breath no longer burst from their mouths in thick white clouds. The floor near the bed no longer cut cold through the soles of Elias's feet. The lamp burned with a narrow, steady flame. Even smoke rose cleanly now, drawn upward instead of bullied back into the room. Lydia noticed the change most quietly. She stood near the north wall with one hand hovering above the logs, not touching at first as if she did not trust them. Then she laid her palm flat against the cottonwood. For a long moment she said nothing. Elias watched her from the table, a harness strap in his hands, the awl forgotten between his fingers. "The wall is cold," she said. He nodded. "But it is cold out there." That was the victory. Not that stone had become warm, not that the cabin had defeated winter. The victory was that winter had been forced to remain on the other side of the air. On the fourth morning, the storm stopped. The silence after it felt almost violent. Elias had to shoulder the door 3 times before the packed drift broke loose. Outside, cottonwood draw had disappeared beneath white. Fence posts showed only as dark stubs. The low hay shed west of the cabin had folded under its drift. The world looked buried, erased and remade. He walked the perimeter slowly. The outer stone was brutal to the touch. Frost filled the mortar lines like pale veins. Snow had climbed nearly halfway up the north face. Ice hung from the little sandstone brow he had wedged over the cleared vent. But inside the gap, the wood was merely cold, dry, dull, and whole. Near the south corner, he opened the rain barrel. The top was sealed in ice thick enough to ring under his knuckle, but below it the water moved dark and heavy. Patch followed him into the narrow space between stone and cabin, sniffed once, and lay down there as if it were any other patch of ground. Elias stood with one hand on frozen rock and the other on old cottonwood. For the first time, he understood what Reese Morgan had shown him all those years ago. Heat did not need a miracle. It needed fewer roads out. Late that afternoon, Amos Brill came through the drifts. He looked smaller than usual in the white world. Ice clung to his beard. One side of his coat was torn, and every step sank almost to the thigh. Elias opened the door before Amos knocked. The man stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was not hot. No one would mistake it for an oven. A pot of beans simmered on the stove. Jonah sat beside Patch with a strip of dried apple, and Lydia rested in the rocker with her sewing in her lap. But the room did not feel hunted. No smoke crowded the rafters. No draft ran along the floor. No chinking hissed. The spoon by the stove hung still. Amos looked first at the lamp, then at the dog sleeping against the north wall, then at Lydia, whose face carried exhaustion, but not fear. He took off one glove and put his bare fingers against the inside logs. Elias said nothing. Amos left his hand there long enough for pride to loosen its grip. "It is not warmer than my place," he said at last. "No," Elias answered. Amos looked around the room again, hearing what was not there. "It just is not losing itself." That was the closest he came to an apology. Elias handed him a bowl of beans, and Amos sat at the table without another word. Outside, the drifts shifted and groaned against the stone shell. Inside, the air barely moved. Spring came late. The snow pulled back from cottonwood draw in dirty strips, leaving dead grass, broken fences, and the gravel trench around the Harrow cabin exposed like a line drawn by hand. Meltwater ran down the outside of the stone shell, found the angled skirt, and moved toward the trench instead of under the logs. Amos returned in April with a notebook. This time, he did not laugh. He walked the north wall, measured the gap with a piece of twine, counted the lower vents, and asked Elias how far apart he had set the high slits beneath the roof overhang. Elias took a stick and drew the pressure lines in wet dirt, where the north wind hit, where snow drifted, where damp air needed a way out without giving the gale a straight path through. Other men came after Amos. Some copied only the stone skirt. Some dug gravel drains against their worst walls. 2 built short double walls on the windward side of their cabins and cursed Elias when the first mortar cracked because they had forgotten to let the wet air leave. Nobody built the Harrow shell exactly. Most did not have the time. Some did not have the stone. A few still could not admit that an empty space had done more work than another cord of wood. But the principle traveled. Break the pressure, keep the pocket dry. Let the air stop moving. The child Lydia had carried through that winter was born in March, small and furious, with a cry sharp enough to make Patch hide under the table. They named her Ruth. Years later, when Jonah was grown and the old cabin had weathered into the color of ash, he could still remember the winter when his father built a wall that was not meant to be a wall. The limestone shell cracked in places, lichens spread over the lower stones. The west skirt had to be reset twice after hard thaw seasons, but the north wall remained. Storms still crossed Cottonwood Draw the way they always had. Snow still buried fences, wind still searched for seams, pressure, dampness, and weakness. But inside the old Harrow cabin, when the lamp was lit after dark, its flame rose straight and quiet. The thing that saved them had not been a bigger fire. It had been the silence of air with nowhere left to run.